Welcome to the Tin Dog Podcast, and as you could hear from the opening music, this week's episode is all about a Tom Baker story. The Brain of Morbius, which comes out to buy on DVD this very weekend. Of course I'm talking Region 2, and for that I'm sorry for anyone listening in America, because it really is a great disc. But before I start talking about The Brain of Morbius, I just want to say a big thank you to Alan Jones of Louisville, USA, for donating to help the Tin Dog Podcast keep running. Thanks, Alan. For those of you who aren't familiar with classic Doctor Who in the way you'd like to be, The Brain of Morbius is a fantastic starting point. It hails from an era of Doctor Who that is rife with homages to other, slightly more popular stories. In the case of Brain of Morbius, most people cite it as being a retelling of the Frankenstein story. I would say Frankenstein myth, but Frankenstein itself was a retelling of various other European myths all hunched together to create a very nice piece of speculative fiction. Our story opens with Tom Baker's Doctor stepping out of the TARDIS and having a go at the Time Lords, in a scene reminiscent of Genesis of the Daleks' opening, only without the other Time Lord. Tom's Doctor starts berating the sky, blaming them for being dragged off course onto a godforsaken planet. The said godforsaken planet is kind of, well, studio-bound, I think's the best way of putting it, but don't hold that against it. The Doctor and Sarah Jane Smith, or Sarah as she's called in this story, although she seems to be being called Sarah Jane just a little bit too often for some people's liking, traipse off across the planet, finding a dead body of some discarded jump-hurt-wee monster, and they end up at the slightly foreboding residence of a certain Dr. Solon. Of course, Dr. Solon has, as is the need of every insane recluse, an ego-type assistant, and of course, not forgetting the locals on the planet, the Sisterhood of Khan. More about those in a moment. Solon seems to the Doctor to have some sort of fixation on heads. He's sculpted one that looks a little bit like someone the Doctor seems to remember from his history books, and he keeps complimenting the Doctor on his own head in a way that really wouldn't have been out of place in a Hammer horror film. And that's what this is a homage to. Hammer horror. The origins of this story are hinted at by something you see in the opening sequence. The story appears to be written by someone called Robin Bland. In reality, of course, the original script was by Doctor Who stalwart Terrance Dicks. Recently in Bradford I had the privilege of meeting Terrance Dicks, and at this meeting he talked at some length about how Robin Bland came into being. This, and referring to sections of the Fourth Doctor Handbook, revealed to us that the original narrative was in fact put forward by Robert Holmes, the then producer of the show, who was concerned that Doctor Who as a whole had never dealt with any stories concerning robots, with the obvious exception of course, the story Robot, and later on Robots of Death. But at this point it hadn't dealt with the robot as anything other than a periphery character. Terrance promptly went away, considered his thoughts on such a thing, and came back with a story about a galactic supervillain who had a manservant who was a robot. This supervillain had been in a crash, and the robot had done his best to repair the body of the supervillain. Of course, it had all gone pear-shaped, and this incredibly vain man had become basically a brain in a jar. Terrance handed in this script, and then made the apparent error of going on holiday. When Holmes was going through the script, him and the production team kinda realised that there was a slight issue. The Doctor Who team really wouldn't be able to pull off a convincing robot that would be in so many scenes. And so Robert tried to contact Terrance, and time was ticking. So eventually Robert Holmes just gave up and created the script that we see before us. Terrance is very accepting of such things these days, but at the time he was slightly miffed, as you can imagine. He actually thought the script that had been sent to him was the wrong script, as it had varied so greatly from his original story. In what Terence describes as a fit of pique, he spoke to Robert on the phone and said, "Take my name off it," because it was of course the only thing he could do. Robert, of course, rather politely said, "Well, what name would you like on it?" And of course Terence said something Bland. So Robin Bland was born, and it was the only script he ever produced, so far. I personally don't like to think of this story as something that was salvaged. I'd like to think of it as the story combining the works of two of Doctor Who's greatest writers, Terence Dicks and Robert Holmes. If you think of it as a joint work, then you can begin to see why this show is seen as such a classic. Another really important part of the classicness of this story has to come from the performance of Philip Maddock as Solon. Philip is by far the greatest actor never to play the Master, and even in this story he has the great beard, the voice, the slightly manic moments, the willingness to betray his colleagues, and everything else that we came to know and love from the Delgado Master. This story is worth tracking down just to see Philip Maddock's portrayal. It's worthy of note that Philip Maddock appeared in Daleks' Invasion of Earth, the Peter Cushing Doctor Who movie, together with Bernard Cribbins, who of course has recently appeared in the new series. In that he was playing some sort of spiv on the run from the Daleks, and has a particularly good death scene. Crashing on. Before I discuss the Sisterhood of Khan, here's a short word from the Bearcast.
My name's Jeb. Hello. This is Terry.
Hello.
We're a couple of old teddy bears.
Speak for yourself.
This is Token Female.
Hello.
Who isn't. We talk about telly. We do.
Listening to you argue.
What are we arguing about?
I suspect you're probably arguing about Doctor Who.
Film.
So what else have we watched?
I am Beowulf!
Beowulf, yes.
And invariably get things wrong. That's what I'm thinking of.
Isn't it? Oh, we've done so much research for this.
There's some cracking music. Well, that button clearly played Soul 3 with Particles and Waves. And even some news about rubbish UFO sightings and the like. Lost Bearings, the Bearcast. Have it.
What does this button do?
Lost Bearings. Lost Bearings. Lost Bearings. Lost Bearings. Lost Bearings.
You can find us on iTunes or btpodshow.com.
The Sisterhood of Khan are an odd lot. They live just over the hill from Solon and have very few dealings with him other than a medical capacity. They appear to be a bunch of slightly overacting nuns who originally hunted down the arch-Time Lord criminal Morbius. Morbius was of course responsible for the state of their planet, and they were there when he was killed. Apparently he's the first Time Lord to ever suffer the death sentence. The Doctor also comments on this when he's the 5th Doctor, saying I could only be the 2nd Time Lord ever to be given the death sentence. I'm guessing it's the same reference. We all know, obviously from the title of the story, that Morbius's brain survived his original execution, and is in a jar somewhere in Solon's laboratory. The Sisterhood, of course, live in fear of him, and in fear of almost everyone else, which is why they kill anyone who comes anywhere near the planet by crashing their spaceships into its surface. The Sisterhood is a wonderful piece of stylized acting, similar in many respects to the performances of the nuns in the new Doctor Who story set in Pompeii. I'm guessing that the nuns appear from other systems and join the Order in the way that most people become nuns of some sort, as there appear to be very few men around, or in fact none. This led to the first gay Doctor Who fan club to call itself the Sisterhood of Khan, based primarily in London, which is a lovely, lovely nod to the show. Of course this story has some wonderful moments. It's enormously quotable. Sarah Jane wandering around pretending to be blind, being blind, and the creature that ends up with Morbius's brain inside of it are wonderful set pieces, well worthy of seeing. But it does have the feel, as many Doctor Who's of its time do, of it being studio bound, of it being almost theatrical. This isn't to everybody's taste, and it won't be. but it is so well respected and so well loved that it was one of the first VHS ever to come out. The legacy of this show can be seen that the character of Morbius keeps reappearing throughout time. He appeared in the 5th Doctor past novels, as well as in an upcoming Big Finish production, of which this is the trailer.
The Vengeance of Morbius by Nicholas Briggs.
He always did inspire such peculiar loyalty.
Morbius is dead. We all know that, right?
Please.
Oh, beg away. Do you think I'm actually going to take any notice?
He was executed by the Time Lords.
Yeah, and when have the Time Lords ever done anything for us?
That lunatic Solon somehow managed to keep hold of his brain, but I could have
Did
stopped
what?
him.
No power in the universe can bring him back.
And what would you know of Morbius?
Oh no.
It's the Stellar Manipulator. It's whipping the heart out of the TARDIS.
Come on, we're gonna make it. Think positive.
Well, I'm all out of ideas, so positive thought is just about all I've got left.
Look at you. Weak and defenseless, a perfect example of your race.
Roscoe, no!
You're going to bring Morbius back to life.
Get away from me!
Always relying on puny females.
Hey, don't go blaming it on me. It was just a thought from a mere mortal.
You and me, immortal. Get away with you, Lucy Miller.
Can you hear me?
Zarodnix has a Morbius fixation.
I am Morbius.
The thing which is worthy of note the most, however, when you're watching this, which is something that fans refer to as the Morbius Doctors. At one point in the story, the Doctor and Morbius have a mind duel, and in this duel there is a small monitor in the centre of the screen, and you get to see the Doctor's past lives. You get to see Pertwee, then Troughton, then Hartnell, and then you get to see Morbius's past lives in an ongoing battle. But then you start to see other previous Doctors. Obviously this was an in-joke, and the people used to play these Doctors were, to all intents and purposes, people who just happened to be hanging around. Robert Holmes, the script editor, Graham Harper, production assistant at the time, but of course now we know him as slightly good director, the production unit manager, Douglas Campfield, the director, Philip Hinchcliffe, the producer, Christopher Barry, the production assistant, and Robert Banks Stewart, the writer of the Zygons story, and of course Chris Barry, another director. Sadly, this nice in-joke kind of backfired a couple of times. First, in reality, where Equity, the actors' union, found out that people who weren't actors had put actors out of a job as far as they were concerned, and also as far as fans are concerned. It kind of messed with continuity. Of course, we didn't know at this point that the Doctor was supposed to be limited to 12 incarnations, something that I'm sure really will not count, as the Doctor hits his 11th. But in these days, they were nicely toying with the idea that William Hartnell hadn't been the first Doctor we'd seen on TV. But it is safest for everyone to assume that these other people who appear are merely figments of the Doctor's imagination, and something we can all sleep safely in our beds in the knowledge that it doesn't really count. Of course, such things end up with conversations between fans, and let's just not go there, shall we? As I said at the beginning of this piece, the Region 2 DVD of this story comes out very shortly. And what about the extras that you got on the disc? Well, of course, there's the commentary featuring Tom Baker, Elizabeth Sladen, Phil Maddock, the producer and the director Christopher Barry. A short making-of documentary, extremely good, called Getting Ahead. There's the contemporary trailers, an isolated music score, the usual Radio Times billings, Easter eggs and coming soon trailer, and best of all, there's a very nice CGI tour of the studio itself. Is recreated on a computer just to show you the layout that was used during production. I'll leave you now with the trailer for the thing we'll be covering in the next few Tin Dog podcasts. The Trial of a Time Lord. Be seeing you.
By order of the High Council, this is an impartial inquiry into the behaviour of the accused person.
Do you mean me?
The Doctor is an incorrigible meddler.
Well, we can't have that. I was on Revelox trying to avert a catastrophe.
The crime was in being there, Doctor! So where is Perry? Where you left her? You killed Perry? These examples of the criminal behaviour of the accused are fully recorded in the Matrix.
the events took place, but not quite as we've seen them.
The idea the Matrix could lie.
Melanie.
Known as Mel. I can't explain, but I have a feeling I am being manipulated. That the evidence is being distorted.
The Doctor is fighting for his life, Valiard.
The Matrix can be physically penetrated.
Who would do such a thing, even if it were possible?
The Valiard.
You have been listening to the Tin Dog Podcast. Doctor Who and its associated shows are all trademark of the BBC. No infringement is intended. Contact us at tin-dog@hotmail.co.uk.